Hi, welcome to The Insight. My name is Daniel Harrington, Chief Operating Officer at Intelligence Fusion. Today I'm joined by Alex Smith, our Global Region Analyst.
Hello.
And Viraj Patni, our Senior Region Analyst for Africa.
Hi.
Today we are going to discuss the conspiracy culture and its impact on security during the COVID-19 pandemic. Specifically, we are looking at three main areas that are having a significant influence on business security and operations. They are the anti-vax movement, opposition to 5G, and anti-lockdown protests. If you like our content, please like, share, or leave feedback in the comments section below. So guys, why are we looking at this subject and the conspiracy and anti-vax movement?
Well, I think the COVID-19 pandemic as a whole has really proved fertile ground for both new conspiracy theories, but it's also served as sort of a lodestar for pre-existing ones. Most notably, as you say, the anti-vaxxer movement and the pre-existing 5G conspiracies, both of which have managed to be tied in with the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah, and also, in 2019, we had the FBI. They cited multiple cases of conspiracy-driven violence in the United States. And of course, they also labeled the QAnon conspiracy theory as a domestic terror threat as well. So, they cited cases where, in California, for example, they arrested a man after bomb-making materials were found in his car. And allegedly, he was planning an attack to make Americans aware of Pizzagate and the New World Order. So we've seen how, there are recent, attacks on telecoms infrastructure as well. So there are real, security implications for businesses and governments as well.
I think as well, the COVID pandemic comes at a time when there is such fertile ground for conspiracy theories, especially in the last decade, when we've seen the rise of social media allowing for new sources of information and influence. So we've seen personalities such as Alex Jones or David Icke, who've got millions of followers and influence. What compounds that is increasing distrust of government authorities and mainstream media during the last 4 or 5 years as well as certain political figures such as Donald Trump being seen to endorse certain conspiracies. So before Donald Trump became president, he was tweeting and was perceived to be endorsing connections to autism and vaccines. So I think what's happened is the COVID-19 pandemic has come at an ideal time for many conspiracy theories to really thrive during the Trump, which have already been, permanent and permeating during the Trump administration as well.
Yeah, and just to jump in on that, what I would say as well is that coronavirus affects everyone in a way that issues around previous conspiracy theories maybe didn't. You could ignore who shot JFK and whether we landed on the moon, because it's not relevant. But the COVID-19, it affects everyone's life, so everyone is interested in it in a way that previous conspiracy theories just wouldn't gain any traction.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a perfect storm, in a way, just like how you mentioned, Daniel. There's rising distrust and disillusionment, perhaps with government, and prior to COVID-19, prior to the pandemic hitting, there were concerns around the global economic outlook as well. So this is why we've seen the likes of Bolsonaro in Brazil and President Trump come into power, and given what they have said around the COVID-19 and how it perhaps isn't exactly as serious as people are making it, as the World Health Organization are making it out to be. I think this doesn't bode well for response efforts, and also given the impact that these figures have on perceptions of people, of their supporters. And as you mentioned as well, Daniel, the social media aspect of it. We've talked about it in previous podcasts about how these algorithms play a role in sort of creating these echo chambers as well.
Yeah.
So I think there's lots to think about here, and it's also, I think, exposed probably the levels of poor levels of critical thinking, perhaps, and the levels of confirmation bias as well in society today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's a really good answer, I think. And have we seen any global examples of historic anti-vax incidents? I know that the anti-vax movement has been around for, since really the 1970s, and we've seen certain responses and individuals such as Andrew Wakefield coming out against certain vaccines and associating them with autism. We've also seen violence committed against polio workers or vaccination programs in, say, Pakistan. Have we seen any other historic anti-vax incidents or movements before the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, I think, I don't think we have to look too far, for any examples of historic cases, because in 2019, the World Health Organization, they warned about, the rising cases of measles worldwide. And this was the case in the United Kingdom, United States, but also in South America, and Japan as well. And, look at the US, a state of emergency was actually put in place in Clark County in Washington. And, we can look at the anti-vax, movement and its impact on rising cases of measles, but there's also other, factors that we have to look at, such as, at least in the United States, how non-medical exemptions allowed in 18 states has also contributed to it. But at the same time, you have prominent, figures, popular figures such as, Jenny McCarthy. She's, a well-known anti-vaxxer in the United States. And, as you've said, you mentioned, the link between autism, that she has made, allegedly, she alleges based on her experience that there's a link between, the MMR vaccine and autism. So, yeah, also, the role that women play, especially affluent women in households, and, the impact that they have on decisions related to this. I think this is why we're also seeing a rise in measles cases in the United States.
And it actually reached the point where the World Health Organization last year listed vaccine hesitancy as one of its top 10 threats to global health.
Yeah, and also in the United Kingdom, when you look at the anti-vax movement, that sentiment has existed, long before, what we're seeing recently. I think it also revolves around, growing perception around government, sort of intervention around individual liberties as well. So perhaps that encroachment of theirs, worrying to some people or certain sections of society as well. And also in developing countries as well, there were protests recently in South Africa, of course, with a lot of protesters, around this one particular hospital. They were sort of accusing scientists of targeting poor people who may not fully understand, the risks associated with taking part in these vaccination trials. And prior to that, you also had, in Nigeria and the DRC, anti-government sentiment has also contributed to mistrust around, these vaccinations. Given the speed at which the vaccines, recently have been developed, there are also, I think, legitimate concerns around this, perhaps. But I think pharmaceutical companies and governments, they have to make it clear, to communicate how effective and safe this vaccine is.
So how has the anti-vax movement influenced the COVID pandemic?
Well, I think what we have noticed is there's been a decline in people's readiness to accept new vaccines and to take them, and this can largely be attributed to the anti-vax movement. There's been a significant increase in its following of prominent anti-vaxxers such as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And his organization. They've seen an uptick. I think they've seen about 8 million new followers throughout the course of the year. Overall, social media following for anti-vaxxer movements is calculated to have gone up about 19-20% this year. And what we see as a result of that is there's been surveys that have shown almost a halving in the number of people that would be prepared to take a vaccine without at least some further encouragement from the medical profession. Around sort of the end of March, according to a survey done in New York of an admittedly small sample, about 60% of people would be willing to take the vaccine, and that about a month, six weeks later, that had almost halved. That didn't mean that everyone became an anti-vaxxer, but there was a big increase in the middle ground of people who said, they would take a vaccine, but they would need further reassurance and encouragement from the medical profession to be ready to do that. The effect of that is, if we were to get in the case of COVID, imagine we do get a usable, safe, workable vaccine, would enough people be prepared to take it quickly enough that we actually society can develop a herd immunity? It's no good having a vaccine if not enough people are willing to take it.
And also, there are certain threats to global business interests, not specifically from anti-vaxxers, but also from a periphery of other areas. So one area that we noticed on our intelligence platform was COVID-19 impersonators in countries such as Sweden, who were going around knocking on doors and pretending to be COVID inspectors, carrying out searches of a property or asking for details and using that to enter a property to then rob it. We've also had people impersonating police officers as well, conducting COVID checks on checkpoints and again robbing people. Other areas that may be a threat to businesses could be counterfeiting, with the huge profits that could be made on sales of vaccines and also medical supplies. We could see an uptake in counterfeit products or false labeling as well. So we've seen historic incidents such as in China where vaccines have been either mislabeled or they've been counterfeited, which have caused injuries to patients. Can you guys think of any other specific threats to global business interests relating to vaccinations or the pharmaceutical industry?
I think most anti-vaxxers will just simply refuse to take the vaccine rather than take part in these direct action protests like we've seen in London, for example. But I think the concern that for businesses is that if there are certain employees that, for example, refuse to take the vaccine, then will there be legal challenges perhaps that these businesses face? And, what way, is there a workaround for businesses? Will government perhaps force people to take the vaccine? And how would they then react to that? Beyond that, I think road blockades, perhaps, depending on the type of intelligence that these groups that have been organizing protests in London, for example, depending on the type of capabilities and their intelligence, we could perhaps see, them targeting logistics firms which are, distributing these vaccines. And this is probably the case, in other continents as well, probably such as Africa as well. And I think we've seen, how in the United States, the likes of Bill Gates and Dr. Anthony Fauci have been targets of anti-vaxxers. And I think the threat is real. And we've seen in the past how in the DRC, for example, Ebola health workers, those that are responding, have been attacked. And so if I was an NGO worker, if I was in the humanitarian sector, and I was delivering this COVID-19 vaccine to a remote community or village where there's already a significant amount of distrust with the outside population or outside world, then we could see attacks on health workers, given that they are on the front line of tackling this pandemic.
I think your point on potential sabotage is particularly relevant given the difficulty in the currently leading vaccine from Pfizer that everyone's sort of the first one people are getting excited about. The difficulties that one has logistically at the minute to do with keeping it cool and in distribution. I sort of think that would make it more vulnerable to sabotage than other probably forthcoming vaccines might be as well.
So we've covered the anti-vax movement. Moving on now to 5G. This is a really interesting area of the conspiracy culture and COVID-19. How has the rollout of 5G technology been tied to COVID-19?
Well, It's interesting because there were anti-5G movements prior to COVID, but this is an example of the COVID-19 pandemic conspiracy really being tied into a pre-existing one, where people have blamed the installation of 5G mobile phone towers as the cause of the supposedly as they say the fake coronavirus. There is no virus, it's the 5G towers, and this is compounded by examples of sort of conspiracy videos that show. There's one that shows a load of dead bees around a 5G tower installation. With typical conspiracy theory, lack of real examination, just slanting it as look. Therefore, this is what killed the bees. It's killing us as well. So yeah, it's interesting how that ties in. Yeah,
I mean, as you said previously, I think with 3G as well, we had conspiracy theories at that time as well, sort of linking 3G, these 3G base stations to cancer as well, which has of course been debunked since then. But I think, going forward as well, when we have further technology, rollouts such as 6G as well, I think we'll see more sort of similar attacks like how we've seen on these telecoms masts around Europe especially.
Yeah, so looking at our platform, we can actually look at trends and patterns relating to attacks on 5G infrastructure. So if we look into our themes area, we can see where and when these attacks occurred. And predominantly, we've seen 5G attacks be concentrated in countries such as the Netherlands or Belgium or the UK. And these really peaked around the springtime, such as April, March, in response to the initial COVID-19 pandemic or the lockdowns. And at the time, the 5G conspiracy theory was that this technology was being used to implement population control, as well as trying to cull vast areas of the global population. And you had some fringe members discussing such conspiracy areas as the Georgia Guidestones, which is an alleged elite plan to depopulate the world and bring it back to like 10% of the world's population. And many of these attacks were carried out by individuals who believe this. As the actual COVID pandemic unfolded over the last year, what we've seen is many of those attacks which peaked in the spring have pettered out. And this is, I think, as a consequence of we realized that the actual coronavirus itself has been as lethal as these conspiracy theorists were predicting. So it's almost undermined their actual ideology and their reason for attacking 5G towers now that the supposed mass deaths on the streets haven't occurred. So that's, I think, an interesting point. And that's using our own platform. We were able to discern that and identify patterns and trends. It still doesn't mean that it might not escalate or continue if there's another twist in the conspiracy of 5G, if there's another influential figure who ties it to some other part of COVID-19. But yeah, it's an interesting aspect that we have uncovered. But just going to the question of where we've seen attacks on infrastructure, can you just elaborate a bit more on that, Viraj?
Yeah, so we've seen, as you've said, you mentioned the Netherlands, for example, and I think a majority of these attacks, against telecoms infrastructure have been in Western Europe, and most of them have taken the form of arson attacks. So we've had arson attacks in southeastern France. We've also had attacks around London, Birmingham as well in the UK, Nottingham, and central areas such as Leeds and Liverpool as well. But as I say, most of them are just arson attacks.
Thank you. So moving on as well now to the anti-lockdown protests. So this is a third part of where we're looking at related to the COVID-19 pandemic and conspiracy theories. We've witnessed recently more and more lockdown protests in countries such as Italy and Spain, and we're starting to see them also appear in countries like the UK. And I think this is due to a variety of reasons. So we'll go into this in more detail in this subject matter area, but with ongoing lockdowns and often confusing and contradictory rules, populations are feeling anxious, frustrated, and looking for answers. So government policy changes and perceived incompetence are only serving as well to compound the problem and undermine faith in government. So we're seeing a lot of people now on the streets who are attending these lockdown protests are really having little faith in government, and many of them are starting to question government policy, and is there an ulterior motive? People aren't seeing an end sight to this issue, and with last-minute lockdowns being announced or very confusing rules, people are really starting to look for other answers. This is compounded as well by increasing unemployment and financial uncertainty. So there's a saying that when people lose everything, they lose it. And I think this is something that we're starting to potentially see in some countries such as Italy or Spain, where they've been subjected to severe lockdowns, where people are getting increasingly frustrated. They may have lost their jobs or their businesses, and they see no way out to this, and they are starting to question government responses to the COVID-19 pandemic. So where do you think we're witnessing lockdown protests and the reasons behind that then, Alex?
Well, protests are really a global phenomenon. We've seen them in all corners of the country, even in China. There are certain hotspots, as you'd imagine, capital cities and business centres. New York, London, Sao Paulo was seen probably the most for one city in South America. LA, San Francisco, but really, throughout a lot of Africa, especially the Gulf of Guinea, right through Middle East, India. Like I say, they're really ubiquitous. They vary in size. They could be anything from individual action or small numbers of people, right up to 20,000 people in Leipzig. They also vary in the level of violence that they manifest. A lot of them are quite peaceful, but some have turned violent. We've seen looting and destruction of sort of commercial business property, especially in Spain and northern Italy. Germany, some of the protests there have turned quite violent. The police have used water cannon at times. And it should be said that there's a broad spectrum, as you alluded to. There's quite a broad spectrum in the people taking part as well, from the small and medium business owners who've seen, their livelihoods destroyed by lockdown, people who've been made unemployed, people with more grievances against the economic side. But they're also joined by the anti-vaxxers, more conspiracy theorists, some just sort of anti-government anarchist types, like I've seen the involvement of Antifa in some lockdown protests. So it really is a broad spectrum. It's hard, and it would be a mistake to label, take one protest or even a group of protests and label them as anti-vaxxers or just anti-lockdown.
And I think that having that broad spectrum undermines maybe legitimate concerns by citizens regarding either sovereign rights or economic policy. So I would imagine that would be, again, an area of frustration for many people who are attending these lockdowns, that they're getting labelled along with the media as either kooky conspiracy theorists, or, as we're seeing now as well, many media outlets are also framing many lockdown protesters as far right. So I think this is an area which it's not productive and not giving a fair and balanced portrayal of those people who are involved in lockdowns, which again may in turn lead to further frustration and further anger from participants who are involved in those protests. And we've seen in the UK, pop stars people from Right Said Fred to various other celebrities involved in some of these lockdown protests who are getting labelled as far right, which seems a bit ridiculous, to be honest.
Well, it shows how polarized times are. Politically, especially, for example, in America, how something like a global pandemic, a health pandemic, which you would think would be completely apolitical, has actually become a bit of, a totemic issue. Right wing, supposed right wingers won't wear masks. Left wingers like social distancing, unless they're protesting something else. And you get characters like Trump being pretty lax in his adherence to any lockdown measures or mask wearing, which encourages his supporters, and it becomes a left-right political issue, which it has no business being, really.
I think the unbalanced sort of portrayal, by the mainstream media hasn't helped in this regard. The recent, protests, the pro-Trump protests, for example, in Washington, D.C., as you mentioned, quite a few, certain probably media outlets, they mentioned, the lack of mask wearing, whereas during the protests, people were celebrating the projected win for the president-elect Biden. There wasn't much discussion around mask wearing then as well. So I think this all feeds into the distrust with the mainstream media perhaps as well.
And we have seen incidents over recent months of people being attacked. For example, on the subway. It's when someone's asked to wear a mask and they get assaulted. And that cuts both ways. We've seen people being assaulted for asking others to wear masks. We've seen people being assaulted for wearing masks, which again speaks to the divide that it's created politically, certainly in the US and I think elsewhere.
So who are the groups and individuals involved, and what are their aims?
So I'll be looking at the different types of groups involved in the United Kingdom. And most of these anti-lockdown or anti-vax protests have been organized by the likes of Stand Up X, Save Our Rights UK, and most recently we also had the Million Mask March, which I think is an annual protest movement.
Anti-government sort of,
and during these lockdown protests, we've had, the likes of Piers Corbyn involved. These are prominent speakers, David Icke as well. And I mean, other speakers include the likes of Niall McRae, Professor Dolores Cahill, Dr. Casey Madej, Sherry Tenpenny, and there's also the prominent anti-5G activist, which is Mark Steele. So, we've talked previously about how all these, different conspiracy theories or those proponents of these conspiracy theories are sort of mixing, during these anti-lockdown protests. But, as we've also discussed, this whole anti-vax movement has, existed long before COVID-19. So it is decentralized as well. Alex, you talked about how, with social media, we've seen these social media accounts by these so-called anti-vaxxers, increase their following by at least, 7 to 8 million people, according to, this report called by the Center for Countering Digital Hate.
I mean, in the States, it's quite centered around a few groups. The most prominent anti-vaxxer certainly is probably Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's got an NGO which is called Children's Health Defense. They're actually responsible for most of the advertising that took place on social media, by which we basically mean Facebook, which is really where this stuff centers. In recent years, prior to the COVID-19 issue, the anti-vaxxer advertising could be sort of traced back to one or two organizations, really. Yeah,
and I think look at the names, just the names of the organizations in the UK, Stand Up X, Save Our Rights, Keep Britain Free as well. So you can just gives an indication of what they're worried about, which is in this case government encroachment related to civil liberties.
So so in the near term, really, what we can expect to see, I would submit, would be looking at all three of these subject matter areas we're likely to see a potential decline in 5G attacks, an increasing resistance to the COVID-19 vaccination program, especially as it's rolled out internationally and also in more hostile areas to outside NGOs, such as certain parts of Africa or Pakistan. And we're also going to see a continuation of anti-lockdown protests, which will likely correlate with the economic environment. So if the economic situation deteriorates in the spring and the new year, we're likely to see more and more protests globally as a consequence.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I can well foresee what are currently anti-lockdown protests fast forward into next year, spring, summer, when the economic reality for a lot of people really bites. Big government spending schemes maybe come to a halt. They won't be called anti-lockdown maybe because we won't be in lockdown, but there will certainly be large-scale protests around a lot of the world, I think, as people's frustration about the economic aftermath of lockdown and the pandemic sort of really starts to affect people's lives.
Yeah, I think in those, I think we'll see a lot more protests. Especially in countries where perhaps the welfare state isn't as strong. Yeah. So as you mentioned, a lot of these economic stimulus packages, if they're coming to an end, then I think we'll see more protests. Perhaps they might just take an anti-government turn as well, and put more pressure on governments. In the United Kingdom, at least, we have the whole Brexit transition going on at the moment, and this has added, that further complexity in how to manage, the economic impact and also the whole vaccination program now. So yeah, I think we'll see further protests at least, at least until December next year. At least what we saw with one of the founders of the BioNTech, the vaccine by BioNTech, he said that we could expect a return to normality by December of next year. So certainly I do see, a lot of protests until then, especially in places such as the United States, where I know the situation is already really bad over there. Millions of people have lost their jobs, and these millions of people also have lost access to healthcare as well. Yeah. So yeah, a lot more protests, especially at the United States, is a place to watch.
Yeah, I think calling it a return to normality is very wishful thinking. I mean, it might be a term to normality in terms of you can leave your house, but without a job, you might not have anywhere to go or a house anymore. And as we know, economic hardship leads to extremism, where that manifests through the political sphere, through the rise of more and more extreme parties. Yeah, people's participation in that, right down to terrorism and crime, as people seek economic opportunity outside of the mainstream through necessity.
Absolutely. So, in summary today, as part of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen 3 conspiracies or anti-government movements that have emerged in prominence and received significant support globally. They are the anti-vax movement, opposition to 5G, and the anti-lockdown protests. By posing our initial question, we wanted to understand the potential security and social consequences of these subject areas and how that can affect both global business operations and personal security. We looked at the business impact of these areas and touched on examples and potential threats, such as attacks on health workers or NGO personnel involved in vaccination programs, arson attacks on technology installations, and continued or escalating unrest in urban areas as a result of lockdowns. Thank you for your input today, guys.
Thank you.
Cheers.
And thank you for watching. If you liked our podcast, please like, share, and subscribe. See you next time on The Insight.